So what exactly was the Oxford Group? Well, it begins with a Dr. Frank Buchman. He was a Lutheran minister. This is back at the early part of the 20th century. And he's running a group home for poor young men in the Philadelphia area. And Buchman has a fight with the 6 guys on his board of directors one night. They're complaining about the food bill. Say, Frank, don't spend so much money feeding these guys. And Frank has a big ego. And he gets angry with these men. And he quits his job. And he'd been scheduled to go and attend a religious conference in England. So he went, and that's what he did. But he noticed something along the way. What he noticed was that because of the anger, the resentment that was festering in his life, to that same degree, he could not be in contact with God. It was almost as if there was a mathematical formula that was working out in his life. To the degree that I hate, to the degree that I hold resentment, it's going to affect my relationship with God. And so he goes to a chapel, not expecting anything to happen. A woman is giving a sermon. He said it was a sermon on the cross. And for some reason, the words deeply touched him, and he underwent a conversion experience, very much like the one that Bill Wilson had undergone. The next day, he writes letters of amends to the 6 guys on his board of directors. And what he says is, I was the 7th wrong man. He took responsibility for his own actions, and he asked them for forgiveness. There was the beginning of our steps 8 and 9. The next day, there's another young man who's attending the conference, and he tells him what happened to him. And this guy says, well, I've got people like that I am angry with in my life. Maybe I'll try doing this. And he writes amends to those people. And he undergoes a change as well. Well, what Buchman begins to sense is that maybe there's something to this. Maybe this spirituality has nothing to do with a doctrine and dogma, but everything to do with human relationships. So he begins experimenting to develop a spirituality that works. And so that's going on for the next 10, 12 years. And it's the period right after World War I. And World War I was unlike any other war in history. Europe was devastated. And people all over the world were trying to come up with solutions for the problem. And Buchman believed that probably the only hope for a new world was going to be some new form of Christianity. Again, not based on theology, but based on lived experience, both with God and with one another. So he starts a group called a First Century Christian Fellowship. And that was the original name for the Oxford Group. He starts working at universities, both in the United States and abroad. He starts taking from other writers things that are effective, pieces of transformational change that could work with people. And one of the things he took was something called the 4 absolutes: purity, honesty, unselfishness, and love. And that gave people 4 things to look at in their life. Not 27 things, not 100 things, just 4. Watch for those. See how you're doing with those in your life. And Wilson said, because he was introduced to them, he said that he put him into steps 6 and 7. When he did his inventory, what we call 4 and 5, he based that on the 4 absolutes. In his last major talk in 1948, Dr. Bob said, in the early days, all we had were the absolutes. And even after the steps came along, he said, he still found them to be helpful. If you go to Akron, Ohio, or Cleveland today in AA, you'll see the absolutes hanging on the wall. You'll hear them talked about at the meetings. Probably no other place in the world is that still happening. But Bob knew that they were effective, and he knew that he loved them and that they were how he underwent his change. And Bill did say Bob was a heck of a lot more spiritual than Bill ever was. And he thought well enough of them, Bob did, to even be buried with them. And I mention the absolutes because I think they play a huge role in two-way prayer. Some years ago, I went and visited an old man by the name of James Houck. And Houck was an alcoholic who got sober back in December of 1934. It was one day after Bill Wilson got sober. And he got sober through the Oxford group and stayed in the Oxford group. He never joined AA, and he lived to be over 100. I went to visit him, hoping to learn more about some of the techniques for two-way prayer. And I left my visit feeling somewhat disappointed. What he said to me was, "Bill, two-way prayer is all about the absolutes." And although I didn't know it at the time, he was exactly right. And I'll say more about this soon. But now it's time to look more closely at this thing we call two-way prayer.